I come to the floor this morning to discuss another act of senseless violence and our nation's response. In the early morning hours of August 21st, the Syrian military began firing artillery rockets into the suburbs east of Damascus, hitting neighborhoods held by opposition forces that have been fighting to end the brutal dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad. We know from the accounts of independent observers, such as Human Rights Watch, and the work of our intelligence services and those of our allies, that many of these rockets were armed with warheads carrying sarin, a deadly nerve gas. We know that these rockets were launched from areas under the control of Assad's regime, using munitions known to be part of Assad's arsenal, and into areas held by opposition forces. We know from the report of the UN weapons inspectors released yesterday that the weapons used, both the rockets and the chemical itself, were a professional manufacturer, including weapons known to be in Syria's government's arsenal. There is no other source of this deadly gas except the Syrian government. Nothing else makes any sense whatsoever. Mr. President, some have expressed doubts that Assad and Russia will follow through on the agreement which was reached in Geneva. To address these doubts, we must inspect, verify, and continue to hold open the option of a strike against Assad's chemical capability if he fails to fully abide by the Geneva Agreement. What I do not understand is why some of the same voices who called for the United States to get Russia to end its obstructionism now criticize the President for getting the Russians involved. Mr. President, I was disappointed to hear my Michigan colleague, Congressman Mike Rogers, make the irresponsible claim that this agreement amounts to, quote, being led by the nose, close quote, by Russia. That contradicts his previous statements that we need to put pressure on Russia to get involved in a solution to the Syrian threat. Chairman Rogers has also said that, quote, what keeps me up at night, we know of at least a dozen or so sites in Syria that have serious chemical weapons caches. And he stressed the urgency that, quote, all the right steps are taken so that we don't lose these weapon caches and something more horrific happens, close quote. Well, thanks to U.S. pressure and a threat to take military action in response to Assad's use of chemicals, the Russians are finally getting involved in getting Syria to respond, and we have taken a major step towards securing these chemical weapons, as Chairman Rogers himself so strongly urged. We need not rely on good intentions from those who have not shown good intentions in the past. It was the credible threat of the use of military force that brought Russia and Syria to the bargaining table. It is a continued credible threat of military force that will keep them on track to uphold the provisions of that agreement. The President has made it clear, and rightfully so, that if diplomacy fails, the United States remains prepared to act. Secretary Kerry, standing right beside his Russian counterpart in Geneva, emphasized that this agreement in no way limits President Obama's option to use force if it becomes necessary. Now, many of our colleagues have stressed repeatedly in recent weeks that the credible threat of military force is essential to reining in Assad, and I strongly agree. For the life of me, I cannot understand why those who have taken that position would now argue, as some of those same colleagues are arguing, that the Geneva Agreement is somehow of little or no use because they say it somehow removes the option to use force. The Geneva Agreement says nothing of that sort. But their argument isn't just inaccurate, it is damaging to our efforts. Why would those who believe that the threat of force is essential to keeping pressure on Syria and Russia want to argue that it is no longer available? Why would those who have accurately said that the United States does not need international approval to use its military forces now argue that the Geneva Agreement leaves us in the position of needing to get international approval to use force in this case, when the Geneva Agreement does nothing of the sort. Some have criticized the Geneva Agreement for not doing more to aid the Syrian opposition. Russia and Syria tried to get an agreement from us to not support the opposition, but they failed to get that agreement from us in the Geneva Agreement or anywhere else. And indeed, the administration is seeking ways to facilitate the additional support for the opposition that so many of us believe is essential. I believe we should facilitate the provision of additional military aid to the opposition, particularly the vetted elements of Syria's opposition forces, including anti-tank weapons. Such aid will help the Syrian people defend themselves from the brutal Assad regime, furthering our goal of bringing a negotiated end to his rule. And I find it troubling, Mr. President, that so much of the commentary on this topic has not dealt with substance and policy. Washington has been and always will be a political town. But if we now reach the point where politics seems to be the only lens through which so many people around here view the most important and serious matters of the day, including national security, speculation as to motives or about potential winners or losers or who's up or who's down miss the point. This is not an ice skating contest with points awarded for style. What is important is our national security and whether this agreement advances it. Removing weapons of mass destruction from the hands of a brutal dictator, a preliminary outcome, yes, but real and tangible, is the direct result of American leadership. A month or a year or 5 years ago, an agreement to eliminate Assad's chemical weapons would have been seen as a significant gain for our security and for the world's security, and not just for the president who achieved it, but far more importantly, again, for the safety of our people, of our troops, and the entire world. I hope as we continue with the hard work of implementing this agreement and as we seek an end to Bashar al-Assad's rule, that we can keep our eyes on those goals and skip the superficial political scorekeeping and the inaccurate potshots that distract us from achieving those goals.